Veltar stood before the observation window of the Galactic Council Station, his luminescent skin pulsing with calm blue patterns that reflected his scholarly nature as a xenobiologist. And he had studied hundreds of species across the galaxy during his 3 centuries of life. But none had puzzled him quite like the humans who now occupied the colony world spinning below. The planet was called New Cascadia by its human inhabitants, a modest settlement of only 50,000 souls who had traveled from their homeworld of Earth to build new lives among the stars, and Veltar had been assigned to observe them as part of the Council's standard protocol for younger species who were still finding their place in galactic society. His people, the Luminari, were among the oldest races in known space, having achieved faster-than-light travel when humans were still painting on cave walls, and the Luminari had long ago evolved beyond physical conflict, settling their rare disputes through meditation and philosophical debate, so the very concept of warfare had become something they studied only in historical archives about more primitive times. Veltar adjusted the observation instruments and pulled up the data streams from the planet's surface, noting the peaceful agricultural settlements, the small cities with their quaint architecture that mimicked Earth's various cultural styles, and the mining operations that extracted valuable minerals from the northern mountain ranges. Everything had been proceeding normally for the past 6 months of his observation period, until 3 days ago, when the Korthax Dominion fleet had emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the system. The Korthax were reptilian warriors who had built their empire through conquest and intimidation, and their ships were massive dreadnoughts covered in thick armor plating that could withstand tremendous punishment. And they had sent a simple message to New Cascadia, demanding immediate surrender and tribute. Veltar had expected the humans to comply, or perhaps attempt to flee the planet, as most sensible species would do when facing overwhelming military force. But instead, something strange had happened that went against every logical prediction in his behavioral models. The human governor, a woman named Martinez, had sent back a 2-word response that Velthar's translator rendered as, "Come take it," and then the entire colony had begun preparations that made no rational sense to someone who valued life and logic above all else. Now the Korthax invasion force was descending toward the planet's surface in massive dropships that blackened the sky, and Veltar counted at least 200,000 Korthax soldiers in full battle armor carrying weapons that could vaporize a living being in seconds. The numerical advantage was overwhelming, 4-1 in favor of the invaders, and the Korthax possessed superior weapons technology, heavier armor, and the experience of conquering 17 other worlds in the past decade alone. Veltar pulled up his communication interface and began recording his observations as required by Council protocol, speaking in the melodic language of the Luminari that his computer would translate into the common galactic tongue. Day 1 of military engagement between Korthax Dominion forces and human colonists of New Cascadia, he began, watching the first dropships land in the open plains south of the main human settlement. Initial predictions suggest conflict will conclude within 48 hours with minimal Korthax casualties and complete human capitulation or extinction. But even as he spoke those words, something in his 4 hearts told him that his predictions might be incorrect, because the humans below were not behaving like any species he had ever studied before. The human military forces, numbering perhaps 12,000 trained soldiers, had not concentrated in defensive positions as tactical doctrine would suggest. Instead, they had dispersed into small groups throughout the urban areas, and were doing something the Korthax had apparently not anticipated. They were singing. Veltar enhanced the audio sensors and listened with growing confusion as human soldiers gathered in their small units and raised their voices in synchronized melodies that carried words about glory and sacrifice and dying for one's brothers in arms. The Luminari had no equivalent cultural practice. Music was appreciated as an art form, but never associated with violence, and Velthar made careful notes about this aberrant behavior. The civilian population was equally baffling, as the humans who were not soldiers had not evacuated to shelters, or attempted to flee the planet. Instead, they were fortifying their homes, and stockpiling supplies, and organizing themselves into support networks that would provide food and medical care to the fighters. Children too young to hold weapons were running messages between positions, and elderly humans too frail to fight were loading ammunition and preparing bandages. And every single human seemed to have accepted that they would resist the invaders, regardless of the obvious futility. Velthar watched through remote sensors as the first Korthax units marched into the outskirts of the main city, their heavy boots shaking the ground and their weapons held ready to slaughter anyone who dared oppose them. The Korthax commander had broadcast a final demand for surrender, promising mercy if the humans would simply kneel and accept their new masters, and Velthar waited for the rational response. Instead, a human soldier appeared on a rooftop, carrying a primitive chemical projectile weapon, something the humans called a rifle, and he aimed carefully at the Korthax commander. The human fired 3 times in rapid succession, and the bullets struck the commander's armor with enough force to stagger the massive reptilian warrior, though the armor held and prevented serious injury. But the message was clear, and Velthar's skin flickered with yellow patterns that indicated surprise and confusion among his people. The humans were going to fight. Not flee, not surrender, not even attempt negotiation, but actually fight against an enemy that should, by all logical analysis, crush them like insects beneath a boot. The Korthax responded with overwhelming firepower, their energy weapons turning the building where the human sniper had been positioned into molten slag and ash. And surely that would break human morale and cause them to reconsider their suicidal resistance. But instead, gunfire erupted from a dozen other positions around the Korthax formation, and humans were attacking from windows and doorways and underground tunnels, using the terrain and buildings as force multipliers in ways that suggested they had planned for exactly this scenario. Velthar increased the magnification on his sensors and observed individual human faces, expecting to see fear or panic, or the desperate expressions of beings who knew they were about to die. What he saw instead chilled his scholarly detachment, and made him wonder if perhaps humans were not quite as similar to other species as the initial surveys had suggested. The humans were smiling. Not the baring of teeth that some species used as a threat display, but genuine expressions of fierce joy and determination, as if they were exactly where they wanted to be, doing exactly what they were meant to do. A human soldier took a direct hit from a Korthax energy weapon that burned through his armor and into his flesh. And instead of dying quietly, as any sensible being would, he threw a chemical explosive device at his killers before collapsing. And his final words transmitted across the tactical network were, "For New Cascadia." Back from his instruments, and felt something he had rarely experienced in his long life, a genuine emotion that transcended academic curiosity and touched upon something more primal. He was beginning to understand that humans might be dangerous in ways the Galactic Council had never properly assessed, and perhaps this observation assignment was going to teach him truths that no database or study could have prepared him for. The battle for New Cascadia had begun, and Velthar found himself unable to look away from the carnage unfolding below. Velthar had spent the entire night monitoring human communication channels, and what he discovered there shook the foundations of everything he thought he understood about civilized behavior and rational thought in sentient species. The humans had established what they called a command center in a reinforced bunker beneath the city, and Velthar had tapped into their video feeds, expecting to see cold, tactical planning and efficient resource allocation like any logical military operation would require. Instead, he witnessed something that his luminary psychology could barely comprehend. As the human military leaders gathered around their planning tables and began their strategy session by sharing stories. Not tactical briefings or intelligence reports, though those came later, but actual stories from human history about battles their ancestors had fought, and soldiers who had died defending their homes and principles. And the humans spoke these tales with reverence that bordered on religious devotion. Colonel Sarah Chen was the commanding officer, a woman of perhaps 40 Earth years, with dark hair pulled back in a severe style, and eyes that burned with an intensity that made Velthar uncomfortable even through a video screen. And she stood before her assembled officers and began to speak. 300 Spartans held the pass at Thermopylae against hundreds of thousands, she said, and her voice carried a weight that silenced the room. They knew they would die. Every single one of them knew. But they bought time for their people to prepare, and they made the Persian Empire bleed for every meter of ground. Velthar quickly accessed the human historical database through the Council's information network, searching for this reference. And what he found disturbed him greatly, because the story was not fiction or mythology, but actual historical fact. The Spartans had been warriors from Earth's ancient past, and they had indeed stood against impossible odds, knowing they faced certain death, and the humans in that bunker were not just remembering that battle, but drawing strength from it, as if those ancient warriors were somehow present in spirit. Chen continued speaking, referencing other battles from human history, mentioning names like Bastogne and Alamo and Rorke's Drift, and each reference was another example of humans choosing to fight against overwhelming odds, rather than surrender or flee. "We are not Spartans," Chen said finally, "but we carry their spirit. We have their blood in our veins, even if diluted by centuries, and the Korthax will learn what our ancestors taught the Persians, and the Germans, and the Zulus." Then the humans did something even stranger, as they began to sing together in low voices that harmonized in ways that created emotional resonance even for Velthar, who had no cultural context for the music. The psalms spoke of homes and families and standing firm against darkness, and Velthar noted that human tears were streaming down several faces, including Colonel Chen's. Yet none of them seemed ashamed of this display of emotion that would have embarrassed most species. Velthar paused his observations and began digging deeper into human history, accessing databases that contained information about Earth's past. And what he discovered over the next several hours fundamentally altered his understanding of what humans actually were. Humanity had been at war continuously for their entire recorded history, spanning at least 10,000 years of documented conflict. And in all that time, there had never been a single generation that did not witness warfare somewhere on their planet. The reasons for these wars varied from territorial disputes to religious differences to competition for resources, but the constant factor was that humans seemed almost addicted to organized violence, in ways that other species had grown beyond. Was not simple aggression, Velthar realized as he studied deeper, because humans also possessed elaborate codes of honor and rules of warfare that they taught to every soldier, and they built memorials to their war dead, and wrote poetry about the tragedy of conflict. Humans were capable of tremendous compassion and cooperation. They had built hospitals and schools and systems of law that protected the weak. Yet they also maintained massive military forces and spent enormous resources preparing for war. The contradiction made no sense until Velthar stumbled upon a human philosophical concept that had no direct translation into Luminari thought, something humans called the warrior's burden. Humans believed that good people had a moral obligation to become capable of violence in order to protect those who could not protect themselves, and they honored those who developed this capacity and used it righteously, while condemning those who used violence for selfish purposes. It was a nuanced ethical framework that assumed violence was not inherently evil, but rather a tool that could be used for good or ill, depending on the wielder's intentions, and this was utterly alien to Luminary philosophy, which held that violence itself was the evil, regardless of motivation. Velthar returned his attention to the planet's surface, where the Korthax forces had advanced into the city, and were encountering resistance unlike anything in their military experience. Human soldiers were not fighting in formation or holding defensive lines. Instead, they were appearing from unexpected angles to strike at Korthax units and then disappearing before the enemy could respond with overwhelming force. The humans called it guerrilla warfare, and Velthar's research showed they had refined these tactics over thousands of years of fighting larger and better-equipped opponents. A Korthax patrol of 20 soldiers entered a residential neighborhood and began searching buildings for human fighters. And what happened next illustrated the fundamental difference between Korthax and human military philosophy. The Korthax expected civilians to be cowering in fear, but instead they found elderly humans who pretended to be confused and led them down wrong streets, while children watched from hiding places and reported Korthax movements to the military command. By the time the Korthax patrol realized they had been deceived, human soldiers had positioned themselves in elevated positions with clear firing lanes covering every exit from the street. The ambush was devastating and efficient, and when the shooting stopped, 17 Korthax warriors lay dead, while the humans had suffered only 2 casualties. And those 2 humans had smiled even as they died because they had protected their neighborhood. Velthar watched as the surviving Korthax retreated in confusion, and he intercepted their commander's report to the invasion. Fleet in orbit above. These humans do not fight with honor, the Korthax commander complained. They hide among their civilians and strike from concealment and refuse to meet us in open battle where our superior strength would prevail. The fleet commander responded with orders to increase aggression and show no mercy, and Velthar realized the Korthax were making a critical error in judgment. They assumed humans were cowards because they used unconventional tactics, but Velthar was beginning to understand that humans simply did not care about fighting honorably. They cared about winning. A human officer said it explicitly in a tactical briefing that Velthar monitored. Honor is a luxury for those who can afford to lose. We fight to win because our families are depending on us and our children are watching. As the second day of fighting began, Velthar noted that human morale had not decreased despite mounting casualties and the continued numerical superiority of the Korthax forces. Instead, the humans seemed more determined than ever, and their tactical communications were filled with profanity and dark humor that other species might interpret as psychological breakdown, but which Velthar was learning served as a bonding mechanism. One particularly disturbing intercept caught a human soldier laughing as she fired at Korthax positions and saying, "Come on, you lizard bastards, I've got plenty more ammunition with your names on it," and her squad mates were laughing with her, even as enemy fire impacted around their position. Velthar realized that humans had somehow evolved to find joy in combat, or perhaps they had culturally conditioned themselves to associate warfare with camaraderie and meaning, and either explanation was deeply troubling. The Korthax commander sent another message to his superiors, requesting additional troops and support, admitting that the conquest was not proceeding according to plan. Velthar made careful note of the growing concern in the reptilian warrior's voice. Then, a new message reached New Cascadia from deep space, transmitted on human military frequencies, and Velthar translated it with growing unease. "Hold fast, New Cascadia. Earth is coming. The cavalry is en route," Velthar read aloud. Colonel Chen broadcast the message across all human channels, and Velthar watched through his sensors as every human on the planet seemed to stand straighter and fight harder. They were not alone, and reinforcements were coming from humanity's homeworld. Velthar suddenly understood that the Korthax had made a terrible miscalculation. They had not attacked a isolated human colony. They had attacked humanity itself. Now Earth was responding with the full fury of a species that had spent 10,000 years learning how to make war. The fourth day of battle dawned with the main human defensive line collapsing under sustained Korthax artillery bombardment. And Velthar watched the tactical display, expecting to see the beginning of the end for the human resistance. The Korthax had finally concentrated their forces and pushed through the southern sector with overwhelming firepower. And human casualties were mounting rapidly as energy weapons carved through defensive positions that had held for 3 days. Colonel Chen's command bunker received reports of units falling back in disorder. And Velthar listened as human squad leaders called in their final positions before communications went dead. And surely, this was the breaking point where rational beings would surrender. But instead of capitulating, the humans did something that made Velthar's skin flash red patterns of alarm and confusion. Because the retreating soldiers were not fleeing in panic, but falling back to pre-planned secondary positions. The city itself became the weapon. And Velthar realized the humans had spent the past 3 days preparing every building and every street to become a killing ground for the invaders. Windows had been reinforced to serve as firing positions, basements connected through tunnels that allowed rapid movement between buildings, and every intersection had been pre-sighted for weapons fire, with range markers painted on the walls. The Korthax advanced into the city, expecting broken resistance, but instead they walked into a 3-dimensional maze, where death could come from any direction at any moment. Velthar monitored a Korthax platoon as they entered what had been a school building before the war. And he watched through their helmet cameras as human soldiers opened fire from classroom doorways and then disappeared through holes blown in walls. The Korthax returned fire with their superior weapons, destroying the entire floor of the building. But the humans had already moved to different positions using the tunnel network, and the Korthax had wasted ammunition on empty rooms. Then Velthar observed something that transcended his ability to remain academically detached, because he watched a human soldier take a direct hit from a Korthax energy weapon that burned completely through her torso. The wound was catastrophic, and by all medical logic, she should have dropped dead instantly. But instead the human woman kept firing her weapon for another 8 seconds before her body finally acknowledged it was dying. 8 seconds was enough time to empty her rifle's magazine into the Korthax warrior who had shot her, and her squad leader later reported that she had smiled as she fell. Velthar accessed human medical databases and discovered they possessed a biological stress response system that flooded their bodies with chemicals called adrenaline and endorphins during combat. And these chemicals suppressed pain and enhanced physical performance temporarily. It was an evolutionary adaptation from humanity's past as both hunters and hunted on Earth's dangerous evolutionary landscape, and it meant humans could continue fighting even with injuries that would incapacitate most other species. The Korthax were learning this lesson repeatedly as wounded humans refused to stop fighting, and Velthar documented cases of humans with broken bones and severe burns still firing weapons and throwing explosives. One particularly disturbing incident involved a human soldier who had lost his left arm to enemy fire, but continued to operate his rifle one-handed while his squad medic tried to stop the bleeding, and the soldier was laughing and making jokes about needing to learn to shoot left-handed. The Korthax commander sent increasingly desperate reports to his fleet in orbit, describing the human resistance as unnatural and fanatical, and he requested permission to begin orbital bombardment of the city to break the defenders. But the Korthax fleet commander refused, because the whole point of the invasion was to claim New Cascadia's resources intact, and destroying the infrastructure would make the conquest pointless, so the ground troops would have to finish the job. Velthar noted that this decision might have been a fatal mistake, because it meant the Korthax had to fight the war on terms that favored the defenders. The civilian population continued to baffle Velthar's understanding of rational behavior, because rather than hiding in shelters, they were actively supporting the military resistance in dozens of ways. Children ran ammunition and supplies through the tunnel networks, because they were small enough to move quickly through tight spaces. And elderly humans who could not fight served as spotters and radioed enemy positions to the soldiers. A human grandmother killed 3 Korthax warriors with an improvised explosive device. When they tried to commandeer her home as a command post, and her final transmission before the building collapsed was, "Nobody takes my house. I raised 6 children here." Velthar realized that humans had bonded to their territory in ways that went beyond simple resource protection. They invested emotional meaning into physical places, and they would die rather than abandon homes that held their memories. The concept of fighting for abstract ideas rather than pure survival was alien to most galactic species, but humans seemed to find it perfectly natural to sacrifice themselves for principles like freedom and dignity. On the 5th day, a human squad was trapped in a shopping complex, surrounded by Korthax forces that outnumbered them 20 to 1, and Velthar monitored their communications, expecting pleas for rescue or surrender. Instead, the humans began singing as they prepared to make their final stand, and the song was something called a national anthem, spoke of their country on distant Earth and the courage of those who had defended it through centuries. The squad leader, a sergeant named Rodriguez, transmitted a final message to command headquarters, saying, "We're going to hold this bridge as long as we can. If we can buy you another hour, it will be worth it." Then the 12 humans in that squad fought for 6 hours against wave after wave of Korthax assault troops. And they used every bullet and every explosive device they possessed. And when their ammunition ran out, they fought with knives and improvised weapons. Velthar watched as each human died in turn, and they sang that anthem the entire time, their voices growing weaker as their numbers dwindled, until only Sergeant Rodriguez remained. Rodriguez was wounded in 17 places and should have been dead from blood loss, but he kept firing his rifle until it was empty, then threw it at an advancing Korthax warrior and charged with a combat knife. Korthax killed him with energy weapons that turned his body to ash. But those 12 humans had held that bridge for 6 hours and inflicted 237 casualties on the enemy. And the time they bought allowed other human forces to reposition and prepare defenses elsewhere. Colonel Chen broadcast Rodriguez's final stand across all human channels, and Velthar observed the effect it had on morale, as soldiers who were exhausted and wounded found renewed determination. Humans were drawing strength from their dead in ways that Velthar found both beautiful and terrifying, because each sacrifice became inspiration for those who survived, and the mounting death toll somehow made the resistance stronger rather than weaker. Then, new sensor readings appeared on Veltar's display, and he enhanced the scanners to confirm what he was detecting at the edge of the star system. Ships were emerging from hyperspace, dozens of them at first, and then hundreds. Their identification signals marked them as belonging to the human military forces based on Earth. The cavalry had arrived, and Velthar felt something like relief mixed with dread, because he understood that the nature of this conflict was about to change dramatically. The human fleet was broadcasting on all frequencies, including those the Galactic Council monitored, and the message was simple and direct and utterly uncompromising. "This is Admiral Williams of the Earth Defense Fleet. All Korthax forces have 30 minutes to evacuate New Cascadia or be destroyed. There will be no negotiations and no mercy. You have attacked human civilians, and that cannot stand." Velthar watched the Korthax fleet respond with their own threats and posturing, claiming they had every right to conquer whatever worlds they chose, and the Dominion would not be intimidated by a primitive species. Admiral Williams responded with 2 words that Velthar would remember for the rest of his long life. Time's up. The human fleet attacked with a ferocity that shocked even the battle-hardened Korthax. And Velthar realized he was about to witness what happened when humans fought without restraint. The human fleet moved through space with a coordination that surprised Velthar, because their ships were not the largest or most technologically advanced vessels in the galaxy, but they operated with a unity of purpose that transformed individual units into a single devastating weapon. Velthar had studied the basic specifications of human warships during his preparation for this observation assignment, and on paper they should have been roughly equivalent to Korthax vessels, with perhaps a slight disadvantage in armor and shielding. But specifications on paper could not capture the difference between a military force that fought for conquest and profit versus one that fought because their families and homes were under threat. The lead human ship was called the Indomitable, and Velthar accessed its registry to discover it had been named after a historical Earth vessel that had refused to sink even after taking tremendous damage in some ancient naval battle. Pattern repeated across the fleet as Velthar examined other ship names, each one referencing some past victory or fallen hero or abstract virtue that humans held sacred. And he realized the ships themselves served as floating memorials to human military tradition. The Korthax fleet commander demanded that the humans withdraw immediately, or face destruction from the superior Dominion forces. And Admiral Williams responded by targeting the flagship with every weapon the Indomitable possessed. Missiles and energy weapons and kinetic projectiles converged on the Korthax flagship in a storm of destructive power that overwhelmed its defensive shields within seconds, and the massive dreadnought broke apart in a series of explosions that lit up Veltar's sensors. The message was clear, and the remaining Korthax ships attempted to scatter and escape, but the human fleet had positioned itself to cut off every retreat vector. Traditional sense, but rather a systematic execution of trapped enemy forces, and Velthar noted that human tactical doctrine seemed to prioritize destruction over capture. The Korthax had expected threats and demands for surrender, but the humans simply attacked without warning or mercy, and their weapons fire was precise and devastating. Velthar monitored human communications across the fleet, and heard something that chilled him, because the crew members were singing as they fought, just like the soldiers on the planet's surface had done. The songs were different. These were naval traditions about sailing in storms and standing watch through long nights, but the effect was the same, as voices united in shared purpose and cultural memory. A human destroyer called the Defiant engaged 3 Korthax cruisers simultaneously and took heavy damage, but refused to disengage. And Velthar listened as the captain ordered his crew to ram the nearest enemy ship. Weapons failed. The collision destroyed both vessels in a massive explosion, but the captain's final words, transmitted across the fleet, were, "We bought you time, finish them," and the other human ships pressed their attack even harder. Velthar was beginning to understand that humans did not calculate acceptable losses the way other species did. They accepted that some would die and treated those deaths as fuel for the survivors' determination, rather than reasons to reconsider the fight. The Korthax fleet was breaking apart under the sustained assault, and their ground forces on New Cascadia received orders to evacuate immediately and retreat to the dropships. But the human soldiers on the ground had no intention of allowing an orderly withdrawal, and they pressed their attacks with renewed ferocity as Marine units landed from the fleet above. The Marines arrived in armored drop pods that crashed into the planet's surface like meteorites, and Velthar observed their deployment with growing concern, because these were not ordinary soldiers, but specialists trained specifically for aggressive assault operations. They wore heavier armor than the colonial defenders, and carried weapons designed for maximum destructive impact, and they moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance as they advanced toward Korthax positions. Velthar enhanced his audio sensors and heard the Marines singing as they marched under fire. And the song was something about halls in a place called Montezuma and shores at Tripoli. References to battles their predecessors had fought centuries ago on distant Earth. The Korthax warriors, who had spent 6 days fighting colonial defenders, suddenly found themselves facing fresh troops who showed no signs of exhaustion or fear. And the reptilian invaders began to break under the psychological pressure. A Korthax officer transmitted a desperate plea to his superiors, asking why the humans were not fighting rationally, why they kept attacking, instead of allowing an honorable withdrawal. And the response came from a human Marine colonel who had intercepted the transmission. "You came to our house uninvited," the Marine said. "You tried to kill our families and take what we built. Now you get to learn what happens when you wake up sleeping tigers." Velthar searched his database for the reference and discovered that sleeping tiger was a human metaphor for something peaceful that became extremely dangerous when threatened. And he realized the humans were telling the Korthax they had miscalculated. The Marine forces pushed toward the Korthax landing zones with brutal efficiency, and they employed tactics that showed no concern for enemy surrender or safe evacuation. Human artillery targeted dropships as they attempted to lift off, destroying several and forcing others to delay their departure. And the Marines used the confusion to assault Korthax positions that were trying to hold long enough for evacuation. Colonel Chen's colonial forces coordinated with the Marines to create a closing trap, and the Korthax found themselves caught between 2 human armies with no clear escape route. Velthar watched as a Korthax company attempted to fight their way to the landing zone, and they encountered a Marine squad that had positioned itself across their only path. The Marines did not demand surrender or attempt negotiation. They simply opened fire with weapons that tore through Korthax armor like it was fabric. And when the shooting stopped, every single Korthax warrior lay dead. Then the Marines moved forward to the next position without pausing to celebrate or rest, and Velthar realized these humans were not experiencing combat fatigue because they had trained their entire lives for exactly this scenario. One Marine unit encountered a group of Korthax warriors who had surrounded a human colonial family that had been caught outside during the evacuation, and the Korthax officer assumed he could use the civilians as hostages to guarantee safe passage. The Marine squad leader's response was to immediately attack despite the risk to the civilians. And in the chaos, the human family escaped while the Marines eliminated every Korthax warrior in brutal close combat. Velthar later learned that 2 of the Marines had died protecting that family, but none of their squad mates seemed to think the sacrifice was unusual or tragic. They simply reported the casualties and continued their mission. The colonial defenders who had held for 6 days against overwhelming odds now fought alongside fresh Marines, and the combination was devastating because the colonials knew the terrain while the Marines brought superior firepower and training. Korthax morale collapsed as their warriors realized they were not just being defeated, but actively hunted by an enemy that refused to stop attacking. Some units attempted to surrender, only to discover the humans were not accepting prisoners. Admiral Williams broadcast on all channels, including those monitored by the Galactic Council, and his message was directed at the Korthax Dominion leadership rather than the troops on the ground. "You attacked human civilians without provocation," Williams said. "You have forfeited any claim to mercy or quarter. Every Korthax warrior on New Cascadia will be eliminated, unless they can reach their ships and leave our space within the next 2 hours." The ultimatum was brutal and uncompromising, and Velthar knew it violated several Galactic Council protocols about treatment of defeated enemies. But he also understood the humans did not particularly care about Council opinions at this moment. Colonel Chen walked the battlefield in her combat armor, and Velthar observed through remote sensors as she spoke with her exhausted soldiers, who had held the line for 6 days. "Stood when others would have run," she told them. "You fought when others would have surrendered, and you showed the galaxy what it means to be human." The soldiers responded by standing straighter, despite their wounds and exhaustion, and they sang that national anthem one more time as the last Korthax dropships lifted off from the planet's surface. The Korthax fleet in orbit was shattered and running, and the human ships pursued them to the edge of the system, before finally breaking off the chase. New Cascadia was free again, but the cost had been high, with thousands of human dead and much of the main city reduced to rubble. Yet the survivors were not mourning their losses, they were celebrating their victory and honoring their fallen comrades. And Velthar struggled to understand the emotional complexity of a species that could grieve and rejoice simultaneously. Admiral Williams transmitted a final message that would be forwarded to the Korthax Dominion, the Galactic Council both, and his words carried weight that transcended simple military posturing. Let it be known throughout the galaxy that humanity will defend its own with every weapon and warrior we possess, Williams said. Any species that attacks human civilians will face the full wrath of Earth and all her children. There will be no negotiation and no mercy. We are done being considered weak because we value peace. Veltar saved that transmission to his permanent files, knowing it represented a turning point in galactic history. The humans had proven they were not victims or easy prey. They were predators who had temporarily chosen to be peaceful. 3 days after the battle ended, Velthar received permission from the Galactic Council to visit the surface of New Cascadia and conduct detailed interviews with the human survivors. And he found himself walking through streets that still smelled of smoke and death. The main city was a war zone, with buildings reduced to rubble, and scorch marks where energy weapons had carved through concrete and steel. But already, the humans were beginning to rebuild with the same determination they had shown in fighting. Velthar observed work crews clearing debris and engineers assessing structural damage, and nobody seemed particularly interested in dwelling on the destruction because they were too focused on restoration. He requested a meeting with Colonel Chen, and was surprised when she agreed immediately, despite having barely slept since the battle began 8 days ago. They met in a temporary command center established in what had been a school gymnasium. Looked exhausted, but her eyes still burned with that intensity Velthar had observed through video feeds. "What can I help you understand?" Chen asked, pouring herself a cup of the human stimulant beverage they called coffee. Velthar had prepared extensive questions about tactics and strategy, but instead he found himself asking the one thing that had truly puzzled him throughout the entire conflict. "Why did you fight?" he said simply. The logical choice was surrender or evacuation. You were outnumbered and outgunned. Any rational species would have chosen survival over resistance. Chen smiled in a way that did not reach her tired eyes, and she sipped her coffee before responding with words that Velthar would spend years analyzing. "Because we are human," she said, "and humans have a saying that it is better to die on your feet than live on your knees. We cannot be what we are not, and we are not a species that surrenders our homes to invaders." Velthar pressed further, asking if the cost in lives was worth the victory, and Chen's expression hardened into something that reminded him why humans were dangerous. "Every single person who died here made that choice freely," she said. "We do not conscript our soldiers or force civilians to fight. Everyone who stood against the Korthax did so because they believed some things are worth dying for." That concept of voluntary sacrifice for abstract principles remained difficult for Velthar to fully grasp, but he made careful notes and moved to his next interview subject. He spent hours talking with soldiers who had fought in the streets and civilians who had supported them, and a pattern emerged from all these conversations that formed the basis of his eventual report. A wounded Marine named Jackson told him about the brotherhood that developed between soldiers in combat, how shared danger created bonds stronger than family relationships. "Would die for any of these people," Jackson said, gesturing to his squad mates, who were recovering in the makeshift hospital. Not because someone ordered me to, but because they would do the same for me. That is what it means to be a warrior. An elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, no relation to the colonel, described how she had gathered neighborhood children and kept them safe in a basement shelter, while teaching them songs to keep their spirits up during the bombardment. I was terrified every moment, she admitted, but I could not let the children see my fear. Adults must be strong, so children can feel safe. That is our duty. A teenage boy who had run messages between units through the tunnel network explained that he had volunteered because his older brother was fighting on the front lines, and he wanted to help somehow. We all have to contribute, the boy said with a maturity that seemed beyond his years. Nobody gets to just hide and let others do the dangerous work. That would not be right. Velthar compiled hundreds of such interviews and began to see the underlying pattern that defined human military culture. They fought not as individuals seeking survival, but as members of a collective that valued the group's survival above any single person's life. And they had ritualized this behavior through military traditions that stretched back thousands of years. He accessed more historical databases and studied human warfare through the centuries, noting how they had refined the art of organized violence to a degree that surpassed any other known species. Humans had developed sophisticated codes of conduct for soldiers, teaching them to be both capable of extreme violence and restrained in its application. And they honored warriors who showed courage and discipline, while condemning those who committed atrocities. The contradiction fascinated Velthar, because humans simultaneously celebrated their warriors and mourned them. Necessity of war. As if they understood violence was sometimes required, but never desirable. He walked through a memorial that human survivors had built to honor their fallen. And he saw that each name was accompanied by a photograph and a brief description of who that person had been before they became a soldier. They were farmers and teachers and engineers who had taken up weapons when their home was threatened. And now they were remembered not just as warriors, but as complete people who had lived full lives before dying. Colonel Chen found him standing before the memorial, and she stood silently beside him for several minutes before speaking. "We remember them as individuals," she said quietly, "not as numbers or statistics. Each one was someone's child, or parent, or friend, and their loss diminishes us all." Velthar asked why humans chose to remember their wars so intensely when most species preferred to forget violent periods of their history. Response became a central element of his final report. "We remember because we must," she said. "If we forget the cost of war, then we might be too quick to start the next one. Our warriors carry the burden of violence so that others do not have to, and we honor them by never taking their sacrifice lightly." 2 weeks later, Velthar stood before the Galactic Council in their great chamber on the capital world, and he delivered his report on human military capabilities and psychology. The council members listened with varying degrees of interest and concern as he described what he had witnessed. And when he finished his presentation, the questions began. "Are humans naturally aggressive?" one council member asked, and Velthar considered the question carefully before responding. "No more than any other species," he said, "but they have refined aggression into a cultural practice and integrated it with their social structures in ways that make them uniquely effective at organized violence." Another council member asked if humans could be trusted to act responsibly with their military power. And Velthar's response was nuanced, because he had come to understand humans were more complex than simple categorization allowed. Humans possess both tremendous capacity for violence and strong ethical frameworks that restrain that capacity, he explained. They are capable of terrible destruction, but also capable of choosing not to destroy. And that choice is what makes them dangerous in a different way than purely aggressive species. The council debated for hours about what to do with this information, and some members argued that humans should be contained or restricted to prevent them from destabilizing galactic peace. But Velthar spoke against such measures, and his argument was pragmatic rather than idealistic. The Korthax Dominion has already sued for peace with humanity, he said. Indicate they are withdrawing from several border territories because they fear further human retaliation. One human colony with minimal support held off a full invasion force, and then destroyed the invasion fleet when reinforcements arrived. He paused to let that information sink in before continuing with his recommendation. Humans are already a military power whether we acknowledge it or not, Velthar said. The only question is whether we want them as allies or enemies, and I strongly suggest we choose alliance. The council eventually agreed, and humanity was invited to join the Galactic Defense Force with the understanding that human military traditions and methods would be respected. Velthar received a commendation for his comprehensive report, but he felt no satisfaction, because he understood that his academic curiosity had revealed something that could not be unknown. The galaxy now knew that humans were apex predators who had evolved on a death world where everything was trying to kill them, and they had survived by becoming better at violence than anything else on their planet. But more than that, they had chosen to use that capacity for violence in service of protection rather than conquest. And that choice made them simultaneously more trustworthy and more terrifying. 6 months later, Velthar was assigned to observe human forces as they integrated with other species in the Galactic Defense Force, and he watched as human soldiers taught other species tactics and strategies that had been refined over millennia. The other species learned quickly that humans approached warfare as both science and art, and they brought creativity and adaptability that complemented the more rigid military doctrines of older civilizations. Velthar witnessed a training exercise where human marines worked alongside Luminari security forces, and he saw his own people learning to move and fight and think like humans. Was simultaneously beautiful and horrifying, because it represented the militarization of a species that had been peaceful for thousands of years, yet the humans taught with patience and respect. On the final day of his observation period, Velthar attended a ceremony where human and alien forces stood together to honor fallen comrades from a recent joint operation. They sang together, combining human military songs with melodies from other worlds, and the harmonies they created spoke to something universal about warriors who risked everything to protect others. Admiral Williams, who had led the fleet that liberated New Cascadia, gave a speech that Velthar recorded for posterity. "We fight not because we love war, but because we love peace," Williams said, "and we are willing to become monsters temporarily so that others can remain innocent permanently. That is the warrior's burden and the warrior's honor." Velthar returned to his quarters that night and began compiling its final thoughts for the supplemental report he would submit to the council. "I have studied humans for over a year now," he wrote, "and I have come to understand why the galaxy trembles at the mention of their name. They are not the strongest species or the most advanced, but they are the most willing to pay the price that warfare demands. Humans do not make war," Velthar continued. "They are war, refined over millions of years of evolution and thousands of years of cultural development. And every day they choose not to be. That choice is what makes them truly terrifying, because it means they understand what they are capable of. When they march into battle singing songs about their dead," he concluded, "when they smile as they die defending their homes, when they voluntarily sacrifice themselves for abstract principles and distant strangers, they are not being irrational, they are being perfectly human. Sentence is why the galaxy will never be the same."